that led to the Doha agreement that started the withdrawal. They became an even more critical part of the process down to the final hours. And it looks like even after the U.S. military withdrawal, they may still be a part of this process to get those last 100 or 200 out.
Allison mentioned it. I want to play it. This is the promise from President Biden to extricate those Americans who want to leave. Let's watch.
Are you committed to making sure that the troops stay until every American who wants to be out is out?
Yes.
So Americans should understand that troops might have to be there beyond August 31st.
No, Americans should understand that we're going to try to get it done before August 31st.
But if we don't, the troops will stay.
If we don't, we'll determine at the time who's left.
And
if there are American forces, if there's American citizens left, we're going to stay till we get them all out.
Caitlin, that didn't happen. And the promise that was kept was to get out at or by August 31st, down to the minute U.S. troops were out by that deadline. Americans still there. The role that plays apolitically, first just to get Americans home, but also within the president's party.
Well, I think allies of the president would point to, they got 6,000 Americans out of Afghanistan. They have been telling them for months that they needed to leave Afghanistan, the U.S. government that is, sending those warnings. And they tried really desperately, they said, to get a lot of these people who were still there out. However, you have to measure a president against a promise that he has made, and words that a statement that he has made, an assurance that he has made that all U.S. troops would stay until all Americans were brought home. Of course, there are no longer any U.S. service members in Afghanistan, but there are still Americans who want to leave Afghanistan. And so the president, I think, will have to address this today, given it's an assurance he made just recently. That's going to be a big question for them, given what Orrin was just saying, how much dicier the situation is, how much more difficult it is to actually get those Americans out now that the U.S. military presence is gone. And I think another question, as they say, this is turning to a diplomatic mission, is what that really looks like, because Secretary of State Blinken told us yesterday that there is no diplomatic presence in Kabul. They've moved it to Doha for the time being. They are going to be operating out of there, but of course that is a lot different than being on the ground as the presence was before, and as the U.S. had hoped to maintain before Kabul fell to the Taliban so quickly. So I think how they're going to get those remaining Americans out who want to leave out is going to be a big question for the White House, and also what this diplomatic presence that they say they are going to have is going to look like without actual diplomats on the ground.
Major General Spider Marks, I want to go from the big picture that we've all been talking about to the iconic picture that many of us have now seen, and that is the last serviceman to leave Afghanistan. And when you know the backstory, it's even more poignant. I mean, these photos, this photo of him through this, these night vision goggles, or this look, is just so poignant, because this is Major General Chris Donahue, Commanding General of the storied 82nd Airborne. He deployed 17 times in Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria and elsewhere, and he spent much of his deployment, we understand, trying to train the Afghan army and the security forces after 9/11. And just hearing all of that just even makes the sort of, I don't know, his body language and the look on his face all the more profound. What do you see in this photo, and how, I mean, I know that you can't speak for all veterans, but how are you feeling on this day, and how do you what do you think they're looking to hear from President Biden today?
Well, to answer your very first question, Chris Donahue is an amazingly talented soldier. And what you see in that image is a soldier doing his job. I don't mean to understate it, but that's what you would expect. First man in, last man out, or person, doesn't matter the gender. And in his case, he really has got the obligation to ensure that no man is left behind. He owned that airfield until the day and the moment he didn't. And so it was absolutely perfect. And it should be the way it was portrayed, that he'd be the last person on that aircraft. And he would not make a big deal of this. I mean, this is just that soldier doing his job. That's exactly what this is. And then in retrospect, I mean, we all have time to be reflective, and I've already made my one statement, which I think is most important to me, and that we may not, I think we could discuss this, but I don't know that we're safer today than we were on 9/11, but I can tell you with certainty we're better prepared. We're better prepared in terms of the individuals we've grown, both in government and in uniform service. Our Homeland Security has never been stronger. Our technology, our sharing is great. So we're better prepared, but we really need to stay vigilant, as we totally, all of us, totally understand.
Important nuance there.
Thank you all very much for the analysis. Please stick with us, because any minute now, we expect President Biden to speak about all of this. Of course, we'll bring you that live.
Life in the U.S. We'll talk to one organization working to help them resettle.
And then a month without power, that's what thousands of Louisiana residents are facing in the aftermath of Hurricane Ida. So we will take you there next.
Right about now, we could all use a pancake. Or 10. So come into IHOP for pancakes, burgers, burritos, and more. Because you deserve something that makes you smile. This guy knows what's up.
Hi, so you're the scientist here. Does my Aveeno Daily Moisturizer really make my dry skin healthier in one day?
It's true, Jen. This prebiotic oat formula moisturizes to help prevent dry skin.
Impressive. Aveeno. Healthy. It's our nature. Try the body wash, too.
Out here, let's get right into the new day. Let's show our pride for this land we call home and prepare to make the most of this summer. Let's get ready to look our best. Then let's savor our time together with family and friends. In more than 1,900 communities, Tractor Supply has everything you need to make this summer memorable, as well as the services that make shopping for it easier. Tractor Supply, everything for life out here.
If you've tried college but never finished, SIOUX lets you transfer up to 90 credits toward your bachelor's degree.
It doesn't matter how old you are, you can do it. You can finish.
Finish your degree at siou.edu.
I booked our hotel and kayak. It's flexible if we need to cancel.
Cancel? I haven't left the house in a year. Nothing will stop me from vacation! No canceling.
Flexible cancellation. Kayak. Search one and done.
Your shipping manager left to find themselves, leaving you lost. You
in 10 clinical...
It was a...
He got
Blitz.
Starting Monday night.
We're here.
Of up to $50 per month with low cost in.
But an animal that's in the trees and moving with.
Veteran homeowners, the 2 1/4 refi is the lowest rate in New.
That we're in a position to do that right now. I'm not even sure it's the right thing to do, even though I am very concerned about all the Afghans and the Americans left behind. I also don't think that our regional interests align with the Afghans. When we look at South Asia, we have strong allies such as India. We have concerns on the western border. We have concerns with the Afghans' western neighbor, Iran. We have relationships with the Stans. We have relationships with Turkey and other nations that have interests in Afghanistan. And I'm not sure our interests are going to align with the Taliban. And I'm not sure we're going to be willing to concede those points or fulfill those desires the Taliban have for a relationship with the United States, if they even want one beyond the tactical and immediate.
Well, they're very much dependent on foreign aid, or at least the Afghanistan government has been for the last 20 years. So it'll be very interesting to see how they conduct themselves going forward. Mark Jacobson, thank you. We've got to leave it there. And any minute now, we'll take you to the White House for President Biden's address to the nation on the end of the war in Afghanistan. But first, we'll take you live to Louisiana, where people are still without basic necessities like power and clean drinking water. And it could be quite a while before things get back to normal. You're watching MSNBC Reports.
Cookies and briars.
For free. Visit freestylelibre.us.
Hey, Joe Piscopo here.
Thank you for joining with us today. It's been a tragic 2 weeks for this nation, culminating in the death of 13 of our soldiers. and at least 18 seriously injured. Earlier this week, we saw 13 flag-draped coffins arrive back home. These 13 soldiers gave their lives to make sure to bring Americans home safely. They were the best of us, and we will never, ever forget, and we will always remember them as heroes. Today on the floor, we took a moment to honor them. We had hoped to have an opportunity to be recognized, to move a bill by veteran Mike Gallagher. It's very simple what we're requesting. We listened yesterday to General McKenzie say American troops have left Afghanistan, but we did not get everybody out that we wanted to get out. I heard the Pentagon say the time just wasn't there to get more Americans out. But let me be crystal clear. This isn't the U.S. government's timeline, it's the Taliban's timeline. Mike Gallagher's bill does 4 simple things. What is the plan to bring Americans home safely? Not some, but every single American. What about the list of the weaponry that has been left behind, accounting for that? A sense of Congress that the Taliban should not be recognized as the government of Afghanistan, and a prohibition of any support or assistance of resources with money to the Taliban. Every member with me today has that simple question. The majority of every member behind me is a veteran. What is the plan to get Americans out? Never in my lifetime would I ever believe America would have an administration knowingly make a decision to leave Americans behind. Whereas just 2 weeks ago, the President promised this nation that he would not leave until every single American was out. We're 2 weeks away of the 20th anniversary of 9/11. We now have Americans stuck in Afghanistan, the Taliban in charge, with more weaponry than they've ever had in the past, and a border that is open. Speaker Pelosi, now was not the time to act like you could not see us on the floor. Now was not the time to hide. We are a co-equal branch. Now is the time for leadership in Congress, and we will lead. With that, I want to bring up Ranking Member, Mr. Boss.
Thank you, Leader.
To try and help get Americans out and others who have worked with the U.S. government. The last plane carrying U.S. troops took off from Kabul at 3:29 p.m. Eastern yesterday, just 1 minute before midnight local time, President Biden's August 31st deadline. The top general overseeing the operation admitted some Americans and Afghans were left behind.
Look, there's a lot of heartbreak associated with this departure. We did not get everybody out that we wanted to get out. But I think if we'd stayed another 10 days, Louis, we wouldn't have gotten everybody out that we wanted to get out. And there still would have been people who would have been disappointed with that.
Here's a bit of background on the Major General Chris Donahue, commanding general of the 82nd Airborne Division, shown here in this iconic, almost ghostly photo, the last American soldier to leave Afghanistan after nearly 20 years. General Donahue was working in the Pentagon on 9/11. This was his 4th deployment to Afghanistan. He led a Delta Force squadron in Afghanistan a decade ago and was head of Special Operations Forces there last year. Last night, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken explained who some of these American citizens are that were left behind.
There are longtime residents of Afghanistan who have American passports and who were trying to determine whether or not they wanted to leave. Many are dual citizen Americans with deep roots and extended families in Afghanistan who resided there for many years. For many, it's a painful choice.
We've learned many of the Americans left behind are, in fact, babies with U.S. passports born to Afghans with green cards who gave birth in the U.S. Those babies were dependent on parents to get them to the airport, and many of these green card holders wanted to bring a dozen or more non-American family members with them, and the Taliban blocked them. 20 years ago, the U.S. military defeated the Taliban. Today, Martha, the Taliban rule Afghanistan once again.
Yeah.
Very hard
Very
images
hard
to watch from the Pentagon.
Very hard, I'm sure, Jen. So tell me, you know, I just keep going back to, and I should mention that we're very close. We're about a minute away from the president right now. But what do you think about what General McKenzie said? If, you know, we could have given another 10 days, but then it would have just been another 10 days after that, and no one would ever be satisfied.
Well, there are thousands of people that they needed to get through, but what became increasingly difficult, especially after that suicide bombing at Abbey Gate, it was very difficult to vet who was coming into the airport safely, and the Taliban were tightening the security cordon around, and it was much harder for Afghans to
deliver the speech at the end of the war in Afghanistan.
Last night in Kabul, the United States ended 20 years of war in Afghanistan, the longest war in American history. We completed one of the biggest airlifts in history, with more than 120,000 people evacuated to safety. That number is more than double what most experts thought were possible. No nation has ever done anything like it in all of history. Only the United States had the capacity and the will and ability to do it, and we did it today. The extraordinary success of this mission was due to the incredible skill, bravery, and selfless courage of the United States military and our diplomats and intelligence professionals. For weeks, they risked their lives to get American citizens, Afghans who helped us, citizens of our allies and partners and others on board planes and out of the country. And they did it facing a crush of enormous crowds seeking to leave the country. And they did it knowing ISIS-K terrorists, sworn enemies of the Taliban, were lurking in the midst of those crowds. And still, the women and men of the United States military, our diplomatic corps, and intelligence professionals did their job and did it well, risking their lives, not for professional gains, but to serve others, not in a mission of war, but in a mission of mercy. 20 service members were wounded in the service of this mission. 13 heroes gave their lives. I was just at Dover Air Force Base for the dignified transfer. We owe them and their families a debt of gratitude we can never repay, but we should never, ever, ever forget. In April, I made a decision to end this war. As part of that decision, we set the date of August 31st for American troops to withdraw. The assumption was that more than 300,000 Afghan national security forces that we had trained over the past 2 decades and equipped would be a strong adversary in their civil wars with the Taliban. That assumption that the Afghan government would be able to hold on for a period of time beyond military drawdown turned out not to be accurate. But I still instructed our national security team to prepare for every eventuality, even that one. And that's what we did. So we were ready when the Afghan security forces, after 2 decades of fighting for their country and losing thousands of their own, did not hold on as long as anyone expected. President flee amid the corruption and malfeasance, handing over the country to their enemy, the Taliban, and significantly increasing the risk to U.S. personnel and our allies. As a result, to safely extract American citizens before August 31st, as well as embassy personnel, allies and partners, and those Afghans who had worked with us and fought alongside of us for 20 years, I had authorized 6,000 troops, American troops, to Kabul to help secure the airport. As General McKenzie said, this is the way the mission was designed. It was designed to operate under severe stress and attack and that's what it did. Since March, we reached out 19 times to Americans in Afghanistan with multiple warnings and offers to help them leave Afghanistan, all the way back as far as March. After we started the evacuation 17 days ago, we did initial outreach and analysis and identified around 5,000 Americans who had decided earlier to stay in Afghanistan, but now wanted to leave. Our Operation Allied Rescue ended up getting more than 5,500 Americans out. We got out thousands of citizens and diplomats from those countries that went into Afghanistan with us to get bin Laden. We got out locally employed staff of the United States Embassy and their families, totaling roughly 2,500 people. We got thousands of Afghan translators and interpreters and others who supported the United States out as well. Translators and interpreters and others who supported the United States out as well. Now we believe that about 100 to 200 Americans remain in Afghanistan with some intention to leave. Most of those who remain are dual citizens, long-time residents who had earlier decided to stay because of their family roots in Afghanistan. The bottom line, 90% of Americans in Afghanistan who wanted to leave were able to leave. And for those remaining Americans, there is no deadline. We remain committed to get them out if they want to come out. Secretary of State Blinken is leading the continued diplomatic efforts to ensure safe passage for any American, Afghan partner, or foreign national who wants to leave Afghanistan. The Security Council passed a resolution that sent a clear message about what the international community expects the Taliban to deliver on moving forward, notably freedom of travel, freedom to leave. And together, we are joined by over 100 countries that are determined to make sure the Taliban upholds those commitments. It will include ongoing efforts in Afghanistan to reopen the airport, as well as overland routes, allowing for continued departure to those who want to leave and deliver humanitarian assistance to the people of Afghanistan. The Taliban has made public commitments, broadcast on television and radio across Afghanistan, on safe passage for anyone wanting to leave, including those who worked alongside Americans. We don't take them by their word alone, but by their actions. And we have leverage to make sure those commitments are met. Let me be clear. Leaving August the 31st is not due to an arbitrary deadline. It was designed to save American lives. My predecessor, the former president, signed an agreement with the Taliban to remove U.S. troops by May the 1st, just months after I was inaugurated. It included no requirement that the Taliban work out a cooperative government arrangement with the Afghan government. But it did authorize the release of 5,000 prisoners last year, including some of the Taliban's top war commanders, among those who just took control of Afghanistan. And by the time I came to office, the Taliban was in its strongest military position since 2001, controlling or contesting nearly half of the country. The previous administration's agreement said that if we stuck to the May 1st deadline that they had signed on to leave by, the Taliban wouldn't attack any American forces. But if we stayed, all bets were off. So we were left with a simple decision. Either follow through on the commitment made by the last administration and leave Afghanistan, or say we weren't leaving and commit another tens of thousands more troops going back to war. That was the choice, the real choice, between leaving or escalating. between leaving or escalating. I was not going to extend this forever war, and I was not extending a forever exit. The decision to end the military airlift operations at Kabul airport was based on the unanimous recommendation of my civilian and military advisors, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and all the service chiefs, and the commanders in the field. Their recommendation was that the safest way to secure the passage of the remaining Americans and others out of the country was not to continue with 6,000 troops on the ground in harm's way in Kabul, but rather to get them out through non-military means. In the 17 days that we operated in Kabul after the Taliban seized power, we engaged in an around-the-clock effort to provide every American the opportunity to leave. Our State Department was working 24/7, contacting and talking, and in some cases walking Americans into the airport. Again, more than 5,500 Americans were airlifted out. And for those who remain, we will make arrangements to get them out if they so choose. We and our partners have airlifted 100,000 of them. No country in history has done more to airlift out the residents of another country than we have done. We will continue to work to help more people leave the country who are at risk. And we're far from done. For now, I urge all Americans to join me in grateful prayer for our troops and diplomats and intelligence officers who carried out this mission of mercy in Kabul and at tremendous risk with such unparalleled results. An airlift that evacuated tens of thousands, to a network of volunteers and veterans who helped identify those needing evacuation, guide them to the airport, and provided them for their support along the way. We're going to continue to need their help. We need your help, and I'm looking forward to meeting with you. And to everyone who is now offering or who will offer to welcome Afghan allies to their homes around the world, including in America, we thank you. I take responsibility for the decision. Now some say we should have started mass evacuation sooner. And couldn't this have been done in a more orderly manner? I respectfully disagree. Imagine if we'd begun evacuations in June or July, bringing in thousands of American troops and evacuating more than 120,000 people in the middle of a civil war. There still would have been a rush to the airport, a breakdown in confidence and control of the government, and it still would have been a very difficult and dangerous mission. The bottom line is there is no evacuation from the end of a war that you can run without the kinds of complexities, challenges, and threats we faced. None. There are those who would say we should have stayed indefinitely for years on end. They ask, why don't we just keep doing what we were doing? Why do we have to change anything? The fact is, everything had changed. My predecessor had made a deal with the Taliban. When I came into office, we faced a deadline, May 1. The Taliban onslaught was coming. We faced one of two choices: follow the agreement of the previous administration and extend to have more time for people to get out, or send in thousands of more troops and escalate the war. To those asking for a third decade of war in Afghanistan, I ask, what is the vital national interest? In my view, we only have one. to make sure Afghanistan can never be used again to launch an attack on our homeland. Remember why we went to Afghanistan in the first place? Because we were attacked by Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda on September 11th, 2001. And they were based in Afghanistan. We delivered justice to bin Laden on May 2nd, 2011, over a decade ago. Al-Qaeda was decimated. I respectfully suggest you ask yourself this question. If we'd been attacked on September 11, 2001, from Yemen instead of Afghanistan, would we have ever gone to war in Afghanistan? Even though the Taliban controlled Afghanistan in the year 2001? We succeeded in what we set out to do in Afghanistan over a decade ago. Then we stayed for another decade. It was time to end this war. This is a new world. The terror threat has metastasized across the world, well beyond Afghanistan. We face threats from al-Shabaab in Somalia, al-Qaeda affiliates in Syria and the Arabian Peninsula, and ISIS attempting to create a caliphate in Syria and Iraq and establishing affiliates across Africa and Asia. The fundamental obligation of a president, in my opinion, is to defend and protect America. Not against threats of 2001, but against the threats of 2021 and tomorrow. That is the guiding principle behind my decisions about Afghanistan. I simply do not believe that the safety and security of America is enhanced by continuing to deploy thousands of American troops and spending billions of dollars a year in Afghanistan. But I also know that the threat from terrorism continues in its pernicious and evil nature. But it's changed, expanded to other countries. Our strategy has to change too. We will maintain the fight against terrorism in Afghanistan and other countries. We just don't need to fight a ground war to do it. We have what's called over-the-horizon capabilities, which means we can strike terrorists and targets without American boots on the ground, or very few if needed. We've shown that capacity just in the last week. We struck ISIS-K remotely, days after they murdered 13 of our service members and dozens of innocent Afghans. And to ISIS-K, we are not done with you yet. As Commander-in-Chief, I firmly believe the best path to guard our safety and our security lies in a tough, unforgiving, targeted, precise strategy that goes after terror where it is today, not where it was 2 decades ago. Targeted, precise strategy that goes after terror where it is today, not where it was 2 decades ago. That's what's in our national interest. And here's a critical thing to understand. The world is changing. We're engaged in a serious competition with China. We're dealing with the challenges on multiple fronts with Russia. We're confronted with cyber attacks and nuclear proliferation. We have to shore up America's competitiveness to meet these new challenges in the competition for the 21st century. And we can do both. Fight terrorism and take on new threats that are here now and will continue to be here in the future. And there's nothing China or Russia would rather have, would want more in this competition in the United States to be bogged down another decade in Afghanistan. As we turn the page on the foreign policy that has guided our nation the last 2 decades, we've got to learn from our mistakes. To me, there are 2 that are paramount.
Got him back now. Let's listen.
Achievable goals. And second, the decision about Afghanistan is not just about Afghanistan. It's about ending an era of major military operations to remake other countries. We saw a mission of counterterrorism in Afghanistan, getting the terrorists and stopping attacks, morph into a counterinsurgency, nation building, trying to create a democratic, cohesive, and united Afghanistan, something that has never been done over many centuries of Afghan's history. Moving on from that mindset, and those kind of large-scale troop deployments will make us stronger and more effective and safer at home. And for anyone who gets the wrong idea, let me say clearly, to those who wish America harm, to those who engage in terrorism against us or our allies, know this: the United States will never rest. We will not forgive. We will not forget. We'll hunt you down to the ends of the earth, and you will pay the ultimate price. And let me be clear. We'll continue to support the Afghan people through diplomacy, international influence, and humanitarian aid. We'll continue to push for regional diplomacy engagement to prevent violence and instability. We'll continue to speak out for the basic rights of the Afghan people, especially women and girls, as we speak out for women and girls all around the globe. And I've been clear that human rights will be the center of our foreign policy. But the way to do that is not through endless military deployments, but through diplomacy, economic tools, and rallying the rest of the world for support. My fellow Americans, the war in Afghanistan is now over. I'm the fourth president who has faced the issue of whether and when to end this war. When I was running for president, I made a commitment to the American people that I would end this war. And today, I've honored that commitment. It was time to be honest with the American people again. We no longer had a clear purpose in an open-ended mission in Afghanistan. After 20 years of war in Afghanistan, I refuse to send another generation of America's sons and daughters to fight a war that should have ended long ago. After more than $2 trillion spent in Afghanistan, a cost that researchers at Brown University estimated would be over $300 million a day for 20 years in Afghanistan, for 2 decades. Yes, the American people should hear this. $300 million a day for 2 decades. You take the number of 1 trillion, as many say. That's still $150 million a day for 2 decades. And what have we lost as a consequence in terms of opportunities? I refuse to continue a war that was no longer in the service of the vital national interest of our people. And most of all, after 800,000 Americans serving in Afghanistan, I've traveled that whole country, brave and honorable service. After 20,744 American servicemen and women injured, and the loss of 2,461 American personnel, including 13 lives lost just this week, I refuse to open another decade of warfare in Afghanistan. We've been a nation too long at war. If you're 20 years old today, you've never known an America at peace. So when I hear that we could have, should have continued the so-called low-grade effort in Afghanistan, at low risk to our service members, at low cost, I don't think enough people understand how much we have asked of the 1% of this country who put that uniform on, willing to put their lives on the line in defense of our nation. Maybe it's because my deceased son, Bo, served in Iraq for a full year. Before that, well, Maybe it's because of what I've seen over the years as senator, vice president, and president traveling these countries. A lot of our veterans and their families have gone through hell. Deployment after deployment, months and years away from their families, missed birthdays, anniversaries, empty chairs at holidays, financial struggles, divorces, loss of limbs, traumatic brain injury, post-traumatic stress. We see it in the struggles many have when they come home. We see it in the strain on their families and caregivers. We see it in the strain on their families when they're not there. We see it in the grief borne by their survivors. We see it in the grief borne by their survivors. The cost of war they will carry with them their whole lives. Most tragically, we see in the shocking and stunning statistic that should give pause to anyone who thinks war can ever be low grade, low risk, or low cost. 18 veterans, on average, who die by suicide every single day in America. Not in a far-off place, but right here in America. There's nothing low grade or low risk or low cost about any war. It's time to end the war in Afghanistan. As we close 20 years of war and strife and pain and sacrifice, it's time to look to the future, not the past, to a future that's safer, to a future that's more secure, to a future that honors those who served and all those who gave what President Lincoln called their last full measure of devotion. I give you my word with all of my heart. I believe this is the right decision, the wise decision, and the best decision for America. Thank you. Thank you, and may God bless you all, and may God protect our troops.
Moment there, but not taking any questions from reporters there in the room, forcefully making that case, at times sounding defiant, aware of the questions that lie ahead here in this country. He said, "My fellow Americans, the war in Afghanistan is over. I'm the fourth president to debate whether or not to come home from the war to bring our servicemen and women home. I made that commitment during the campaign to end the war." He said today, "I honored that commitment," saying, "I refuse to send another generation of America's sons and daughters to fight a war that should have ended long ago," in his words.
In that country, the president warning those who killed more than a dozen service members last week, quote, "We will not forgive, we will not forget, we will hunt you down." The president said it was a unanimous recommendation from his top advisors to leave by today, and that there is no deadline to get the remaining Americans and Afghan allies out of that country. He said the administration had
He took on every criticism that we have heard in recent days, especially from Republicans who have really hammered at the president, not only for his decision to withdraw, but the way that he did it. And he went down the line responding to that. He also talked about his decision not to extend the presence beyond August 31st, even though he had said that is exactly what he would order if there were Americans who remained in Afghanistan who were still trying to evacuate. And we know that about 100 to 200 Americans are trying to do just that. He pledged that he would continue the diplomatic effort to reach out to them and help them get back home. I did think it was interesting that he made a point to say the U.S. had tried to contact them since March and contacted them nearly 20 times to let them know if they wanted to return, the time to put that plan in motion was now. But Nora, much of what he said just now is not new. This was a defense of his decision to leave Afghanistan, and he made clear he was not going to pass this war on to a fifth president. Nora?
Weijia Jiang, thank you. National security correspondent David Martin is at the Pentagon. And David, first, part of this is about, in the president's words, not continuing this war for a third decade. But also he said this is not in an expensive war that is not in the national security interests of the United States. He used that word, ending an era, turning the page to deal with other threats that face America. And he talked about Russia and China. Explain that larger national security focus that the president was talking about.
Well, ever since the Obama administration, the U.S. has been trying to focus on China as the great threat in the rest of this century. And every time it tries to focus on China, something pops up in the Middle East again. It's either Iran or the continuing cost of maintaining the war effort in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And even for this final pullout, they had to divert an aircraft carrier, had to hold troops on station in order to conduct this evacuation. Those are all resources that the U.S. has for many years now wanted to devote to China and the Pacific.
Taliban, they have fought side by side together for the last 20 years, and there are numerous reports that al-Qaeda leaders are going back home, being welcomed in some cases as heroes back in Afghanistan. Then there is also the inspirational aspect of all of this. It doesn't necessarily have to be that the next Osama bin Laden is sitting in Tora Bora, is sitting in Afghanistan. It is the example of what has just happened, the example that a small group of Islamist fighters can push out a superpower that could inspire the next bin Laden. So President Biden talked a lot about this war being yesterday's threat, that it had gone on too long, and a lot of Americans support leaving Afghanistan. But he didn't talk very much about the current dangers, the current situation, the threats that we face today, because a state in Central Asia has collapsed. It is now being controlled by the Taliban. The Taliban still have relations with other extremist groups. No real indications that they're going to break those ties. And the region itself is very, very nervous about further instability. Iran is spreading its influence. Pakistan, which has 200 million people and nuclear weapons, shares a border with Afghanistan, many tribal connections, many militant groups just on the Pakistani side of the border who could very easily be inspired by what has happened in Afghanistan. So when you talk about future threats, I think you need to recognize that what has happened right now is also extraordinarily dangerous for Afghans, for the regions, and potentially also for Americans.
Yeah, Richard, thank you. And on that point of future threats, I want to bring in NBC National Security and Military Affairs correspondent Courtney Cubian. She is live for us at the Pentagon today. Now,
all right, Martha just said it. I was not going to extend this forever war. The President of the United States explaining why, after 20 years, we are now out of Afghanistan, and our longest war is now in the rearview mirror. But growing questions that might not be the case, and growing concerns for the tens of thousands left behind as to their safety and whether anyone, anywhere, is going to help them and get them out of that country. Welcome, everybody. I'm Neil Cavuto, and this is Your World. And growing confusion as to the message of the Commander-in-Chief about our now completed role in Afghanistan and whether we actually completed the role, whether all Americans who wanted out got out. That is not the case. They didn't. And then all the others who wanted out, who now increasingly look like they could be targets of the Taliban. Fast-moving developments ahead of a White House briefing moments away. Let's go to Jennifer Griffin at the Pentagon on the implications of this huge day. Jennifer.
Men and women who serve in Afghanistan, the president also addressing that. And certainly this final chapter that we saw in just the last week, the 20 wounded and the 13 American heroes who lost their lives there at the Kabul airport. I want to bring in Jericho Denman, a former Army Ranger, 15 deployments, combat deployments to both Iraq and Afghanistan. And Jericho, I know you were in Kabul in the days leading up to that suicide attack. You saw the brave work, the Marines right there at the airport gate. And I'm curious your thoughts after what you've heard from the president at the end of this 20-year war.
My thoughts in regard to the evacuation are that he was right. In regard to the bravery of the Marines and the PJs and everyone out there at those gates. The thing that really comes to mind when I listen to his statements, though, is where was this clarity 5 years ago? Where was this clarity 10 years ago? And what are we going to be doing about that in the weeks and months to come? I think myself and some of us thought, yeah, this over the horizon could have taken place, back in November of '01 when we, defeated the Taliban. But now that we're here, I think that there are some answers that should be, or some questions that should be answered in regard to where this clarity was, before.
Well said. Jericho Denman, a former Army Ranger, talking about the clarity and the questions moving forward.
For years. So that's certainly a criticism that you can knock down. What he didn't address, and I found that interesting, and I think probably the most of all the criticisms that you've heard about the Biden administration handling of this withdrawal, and I think he's right to a certain degree that it would have been chaotic no matter what. You didn't hear President Biden addressing the American immigration and visa system and the bureaucracy that has tied up these SIV visa applications. He didn't address why the State Department moved so slowly, did not act as if, they were in a crisis. They acted as if they had years to go ahead and approve these visa applicants, so that you ended up with some of the scenes we saw at the airport in Kabul, which you would have seen some of those scenes anyway, but I don't think it would have been quite as devastating. And if the State Department and Homeland Security had moved a little bit faster, I think President Biden could have stood up and said to the American people, look, over the past few months, we've already gotten out 150,000 people. Look at what we've just done in anticipation of this. And they haven't been able to do that. So I thought his speech was pretty much what you would expect to hear at this point in time. I think he's certainly right that we have just witnessed an extraordinary airlift. The fact that the military and American officials and the coalition in Afghanistan managed to get more than 125,000 people evacuated from HKIA airport so quickly in just 2 weeks. I think that's an extraordinary thing. I think history will look back at that as something definitely to note. But I do think the administration and President Biden has to be careful of this presentation, this tendency that they have to constantly try to accentuate the positive in the ending of a war that is impossible to say is ending in anything other than a defeat. And by constantly emphasizing, you see that when Jake Sullivan talks, the National Security Advisor, you see that when Secretary of State Antony Blinken talks, the administration officials are constantly talking, look, we've been able to do this, look, we've been able to do that, sure. But we're also seeing the end of a 20-year war in which so many people, so many lives lost, are asking the question of what was it all for? And if you don't recognize a little bit of this futility when you're speaking to the American public, you end up losing the trust of the American public because they're not going to pay attention to what you have to say. And I think that's a danger that the administration needs to be aware of.
And Paul Rykov, I watched your Twitter feed during the speech, so I think I know where you're heading. But to Helene's point, you can't spin the war to the men and women who fought it. And I wonder, I saw that you reacted positively. He offered in that speech, in an address to the nation, to meet with the veterans who view the Afghan interpreters and their families as their brothers. They're texting with them because they have all their phone numbers and they've stayed in touch with them. They may have left the country when they came back home, but these interpreters they view as family. I talked to a veteran who was part of the calls who says he feels heard, but I know you still feel like there is a lot more work to be done. I wonder your reaction to the president's speech specifically on these issues.
Well, this is not a good news story. I think that's the top line message here that Helene is nailing. I mean, this is a very optimistic way of portraying what has been a devastatingly catastrophic couple of weeks after a terrible 20-year experience for all of us. So there's a deliberate reframing here that really, frankly, rubs me the wrong way. We keep hearing you're going to go after ISIS-K and you're going to hit them back for hitting us. But who's going to be held accountable for the failures that have left so many people to die and so many people jammed at the gate? And there's still really, Helene is hitting on a core part of what many veterans and folks in the military who could speak candidly will call a betrayal. You can't just talk about how many you got out. We have to talk about how many you left behind. And yes, it was fantastic that they got over 100,000 out. That is notable. But the situation was also so bad that we had to get out that many that quickly. And we still don't know how many have been left behind. It may be hundreds of thousands. So there's an effort here to spike the ball, to say this is a good news story. We're moving on. And by the way, we're out of Afghanistan, but we're going to keep fighting. So how do you have both? There's a both sidesism here that I think is going to catch up with them. And there's another point that I think is really critical. President Biden understands veterans at a very visceral level, and he showed real reverence for them. But he also did what politicians do, which is use them as a shield for political decisions. And that's a very tight rope to walk. We want to be understood. We have our issues that need to be addressed, but you can't hide behind the generals when you make political decisions. You can't hide behind the sacrifice of the military when you're making tough political
the U.S. role in the world and what it should be and what it shouldn't be. And without any doubt at all, he has long held the view that it shouldn't be engaged in wars like have taken place over the course of the last 2 decades. And I think White House officials are keenly aware that is something that is agreed upon by a majority of Americans. There's no question about it. Both candidates in the 2020 presidential election race held that position of withdrawing from Afghanistan. And I think that, more than anything else, was the message that the president wanted to get out through this speech, kind of get past everybody's micro-focus on the last 16 days and focus bigger picture on what getting America out of Afghanistan for the first time in 20 years means more broadly for U.S. foreign policy, for U.S. national security posture, for U.S. military forces in particular. I think the reality remains that while the administration has been clear that they are going to take a diplomatic track and have received commitments from the Taliban related to the 100-plus Americans that are still on the ground, related to the hundreds, if not thousands, of Afghan allies, including SIV applicants, eligible individuals, while they are going to continue to pursue that, those individuals are still on the ground, and there are still a lot of questions about what the process will be to get them out. And there were also the pledges that the president made before now. And those pledges were that every American who wanted to get out would be able to get out, and if not, he would extend the deadline, that Afghan SIV applicants, Afghans who helped American personnel, would be able to get out. That obviously did not come to pass. The president explained and made very clear that their understanding, their kind of idea of facts on the ground was anything beyond August 31st, the Taliban would make things extraordinarily difficult. But the bottom line here, when you look at the operation itself over the course of the last 16 days, Jake, is the Taliban was running security for U.S. forces. The Taliban was essentially allowing who could and could not get into the Kabul airport. And the Taliban more or less implicitly dictated when the United States left Afghanistan. On net, President Biden is pleased and believes that withdrawal was exactly what he campaigned on and what the American public wanted. How it pertains to the last 16 or 17 days, though, I think is still very much an open question.
Phil Mattingly at the White House, and we should tell you that White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki is going to begin briefing in a second, and when she does, we're going to take at least some of that, at least the top of the remarks. But before we go to that, before Psaki begins, Ambassador Lute, we're in a period now where people are taking a look back at the 20 years of war. Craig Whitlock at the Washington Post sued and got copies of this thing called the Lessons Learned Project that the Army was doing, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan. And you have a very potent quote in that. You told the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan in 2015, quote, "We were devoid of a fundamental understanding of Afghanistan. We didn't know what we were doing. What are we trying to do here? We didn't have the foggiest notion of what we were undertaking. If the American people knew the magnitude of this dysfunction, 2,400 lives lost." You called it a fundamental lack of knowledge that the U.S. had about Afghanistan. Did the U.S. ever really come to understand Afghanistan?
Well, first of all, Afghanistan is an enormously complex, and for Americans, an enormously foreign place. There may not be a more complex and foreign place on the face of the earth than Afghanistan. So when we went in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, we went in with a sense of urgency because we weren't sure that the attacks on 9/11 were the last attacks. In fact, there was some intelligence suggesting that there was more to come. So we rushed and we accomplished our immediate goal, which was to displace the Taliban, to cause al-Qaeda to flee, mostly into Pakistan, and then we were left with the rest of the problem in Afghanistan. And my comments to the Inspector General reflected that in my experience. At the 10-year mark of personally working on this problem.
So 2011.
Well, for me, a few years after that. But when I had accumulated 10 years, I was still learning things that were fundamental to the underlying conditions in Afghanistan. I was learning things about the demographics, about the geography, about the neighborhood, about the political culture in Afghanistan, things that should have been instrumental in forming policy. And so I learned myself much over that 10-year period, and yet many of our decision makers, to include many of our senior military officers, our diplomats and so forth, didn't have 10 years of steady attention, steady focus on this problem. So there's another famous quote, not mine, that we weren't there for 20 years, we were there for 1 year, 20 years.
Right, it wasn't one 20-year war, it was 21-year wars.
And I think there's something to that. Our fundamental understanding of Afghanistan was often at the 101 college level, and we needed master's degrees.
Caitlin Collins, while we're waiting for Jen Psaki to come out, which should be in about a minute or so, President Biden has been putting part of the blame for the withdrawal on President Trump and the deal that the Trump administration cut with the Taliban for withdrawal May 1st. What did you make of that? And I guess a different question I have is, even if one criticizes the deal that Trump cut with the Taliban, is Biden really that upset about bringing an end to the war? That was the one thing that both Biden and Trump seemed to agree on in 2020, is ending the war.
And I think, that, Jake, that is exactly right. That was part of that speech. This is frustration built up that President Biden has because he has been arguing for years that this war should come to an end, that the U.S. involvement in Afghanistan should stop. This is a long-held belief he has had long before he was running for president, since he was vice president, an argument he tried to make while he was vice president that, of course, was unsuccessful at the time. And so I think that is a major underlying factor in this decision. I think the decision that former President Trump struck with the Taliban is part of it, but I think that is an even bigger aspect of the decision-making that happened here. And certainly he said that essentially he felt like he had to make a decision when it came to him taking office and facing that May 1 deadline. He did tell ABC News recently, though, that he would have found a way to pull out troops regardless because he believed that was the right thing to do and that the U.S. involvement there had long overstayed its welcome and was time to come to an end. And that is a philosophy he's tried to explain to us multiple times and tried to break through as they've talked about the criticism. That's different than criticizing or asking questions about how this withdrawal was executed, but the fact behind the withdrawal is something that he has believed in for quite some time, Jake, and an argument that he has long advocated for, at times unsuccessfully, but of course now he is commander-in-chief and now it is his decision to make.
Clarissa,
I'm Sam Wright. Today on Dakota News Now, Mitchell School District is requiring masks inside all district buildings tomorrow, and South Dakota's National Guard will assist Monument Health with COVID-related matters. These stories are today at 4 on KDLT.
Like we said, my personal favorites.
Women and girls, as we speak out for women and girls all around the globe.
Continue. He has made clear that the state, tribal, and local officials who have requests for anything have our full support, and we are, of course, in close contact. Today, the FEMA administrator and the American Red Cross director in Louisiana to meet with the governor and survey the damage from Hurricane Ida. Administrator Criswell will travel to Mississippi tomorrow to meet with state officials. And as Ida continues to move to the northeast, we expect heavy rain to continue. There's life-threatening flash flooding that remains a threat in West Virginia, Pennsylvania, D.C., and elsewhere. In the Gulf Coast, search and rescue efforts are underway. 12 urban search and rescue teams are currently operational in Louisiana to support state and local efforts. The Coast Guard has been doing overhead flights, including in Grand Isle, to search for anyone in need of assistance. So far, urban search and rescue teams have assisted over hundreds of survivors, and their work continues. We're also in regular contact, which is a huge priority for people in the region, with private electricity companies to ensure they have the resources they need as they work to restore power in Louisiana and Mississippi, where more than 1.1 million customers remain without electricity. We've seen some people in Mississippi get electricity back, and we're hopeful we'll see continued improvements. There are more than 25,000 linemen from 32 states and D.C. in the region racing to restore power. And FEMA has staged nearly 250 generators in the region to support impacted areas. We're going to get more generators to the area to get more power to the emergency services that need it the most. We also want to make sure that individuals in the impacted areas of Louisiana know they can apply for federal assistance. We would encourage anyone in need of assistance to visit disasterassistance.gov or call 1-800-621-FEMA. As of this morning, 48 shelters are open in affected areas throughout the Gulf Coast. FEMA has staged more than 4.4 million meals, 3.2 million liters of water, and more than 124,000 tarps in the region. And additional ambulance crews have been transported to Louisiana and Mississippi. The Department of Transportation also issued a regional emergency declaration for states including Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Texas, providing flexibility for transporting fuel as well as essential items like food, water, and power restoration equipment to support emergency relief efforts. And today we have two additional actions to announce to increase the availability of gasoline and ease price pressures. First, the department will extend and amend an emergency declaration that offers temporary flexibility to how many hours a truck driver can drive. This applies nationally to goods that support the COVID-19 response and will now include gasoline and other types of fuel, building materials, medical supplies, and food. Because the hurricane is hitting a region that is a key center of the nation's oil production and refining infrastructure, this waiver should help reduce the risk of gasoline shortages or price increases stemming from the hurricane. DOT's top priority remains safety, and this waiver is accompanied by additional safety-related reporting requirements to allow the department to monitor driver working hours. And second, the EPA has approved emergency fuel waivers for Louisiana and Mississippi, effective immediately, which will expand the supply of gasoline that can be sold in these two states and increase availability at this critical time. We are continuing to assess, and we'll continue to provide you all updates. Why don't you kick it off, Josh? Good to see you.
Good to see you. Thanks, Jen. Two subjects. First on Afghanistan.
Taliban, are they now our frenemy? Are they our adversary? Are they our enemy? What are they?
Well, it's hard to put a label on it, in part because we have yet to see what they are going to be now that they are in control, physical control of Afghanistan. They will, in the coming days, announce a government. That government is going to go around seeking diplomatic engagement, even recognition from other countries, including the United States. In fact, the Taliban spokesman today said he was looking for positive relations on behalf of the Taliban, especially with the United States. We're not just going to grant positive relations to the Taliban. They are going to have to earn everything from the international community through actions, not words. That begins with safe passage for Americans and Afghan allies. And that also includes them living up to their counterterrorism commitments, including that Afghanistan can never again be used as a base from which to attack the United States or our allies again.
Jake Sullivan, I want to just give you a last word on this. Seemed like a president exasperated. He did what he said he was going to do. He followed through on the exact same policy put in motion by his predecessor, with whom he agrees on very little, but it was Donald Trump who made this deal with the Taliban. Is there a feeling of frustration that some of the foreign policy establishment and media is piling onto this president when he's simply doing what he said he was going to do and following through on a deal made by the guy who came before him?
I think what you heard today, Nicole, was a president with conviction, genuine, deep conviction. It starts in his gut, it goes to his heart, and it occupies his head that the time had come for this war to end. The time had come for us to shift to a different model of fighting terrorism in Afghanistan and around the world. The time had come to bring American men and women home so that we were not entering a third decade in the middle of a civil war in another country, indeed in a country where the side we were supporting was not prepared to fight for itself. So the president isn't really thinking about all the media noise or all the critics. What he is thinking about is why he did this. And he did want to respond not to the chattering class, but to the arguments put forward about why we should stay. He really wanted to address those head on and say that he did not find merit or purchase in those arguments, that he thought the right and the sound decision for the American people and the American national security interest was to end the war in Afghanistan. He is proud that he did it. He is convicted in his having done so. And now, standing here today, he feels he's followed through on a commitment he made to the American people.
National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, I know these are extremely busy days for folks in your job. We're very grateful that you took some time to field our questions. Please come back. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Jake. I want to come straight to you, Paul Rieckhoff, because I really am trying to understand. This is a president in a White House that is trying to do the right thing. There's a veterans community still very unsatisfied with the state of that effort. And I wonder if Jake Sullivan there offered some clarity or if this is, tell me your reaction.
No, he's doubling down. The idea this is, this all went really well and there's a bunch of minor mistakes and a small group of chattering class that are, getting in the president's way. We know he cares. We know people care. But there's an issue here that has to be pulled apart. The withdrawal is different from the evacuation. And the evacuation was marred with incompetence and failure and disorganization and lies. And that is the part that people right now who are close to it are focused on. And he still didn't give you an answer for what we do for the SIVs that are right there now being hunted by the Taliban and will be killed. It's not a good thing that he has to work with his family through a phone tree to get them out. We should have a government system in place. And that's where you see the outrage. It's wonderful that so many veterans stood up. The American public has rallied, but we're rallying because our government failed. And where is the accountability? That is the question for Jake Sullivan, and that is the question for the president that he continues to refuse to answer.
Helene, what is the answer to these questions at the Pentagon?
Well, it was interesting listening to Jake because there's it's listening to the Biden administration right now, and they definitely, many members of them definitely sound, including the president at some point, sound like they are on the defensive, probably with good reason. They're getting a lot of criticism, but you can't conflate criticism over the decision to withdraw, which is one thing, and with criticism over the actual how we carried out that withdrawal. And that's sounded to me like what our national security advisor just did. And to a certain extent, that's what President Biden sometimes does. When you hear them talking about we needed to, why the chattering classes who say that we could have left 2,500 to 4,000 people there and it wouldn't be, it would be low risk. The Pentagon recommended that we leave 3,000 to 4,500 troops in Afghanistan. They never said that's going to be low risk. They knew, and they said at the time that this could be, you're going to be, in exchange for that, unlike Korea or Germany, where we have 25,000 troops, you have much fewer in Afghanistan, but the trade-off for that is going to be you're going to lose some troops every year for a long period of time. So there was no this is going to be a low-risk situation because you're in a war zone, but you have to differentiate that from the whole how this withdrawal was actually carried out. And when you look at how President Biden makes a decision, he says, we are going to withdraw. And then below that, there are many, many things that have to happen after that decision in order to make this so that this decision can be executed properly. And that is where the American bureaucracy fell down. That's where the entire national security apparatus that is run by the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, started to not fire on all of its own synapses. So it's once the president makes a decision, it is his national security advisor who is supposed to look at how the different bureaucracies and how the different agencies carry this decision out and put in place what they need to do in order to get this done as smoothly as a chaotic situation would allow. And that's where you're seeing a lot of the more substantial criticism of the government, I think.
Rick Stengel.
I think it was a speech that really reflected Joe Biden's heart, and a speech that he feels was the ultimate delivery on a commitment he made to the American people to end this war.
We had former Bush and Obama war czar Doug Lute on before you came on, and he was talking about how this is a position that then Vice President, now President Biden, has had for more than a decade, wanting to end the U.S. involvement in the war in Afghanistan. The war is over, but of course, involvement with Afghanistan is not over because, as President Biden just acknowledged, there are up to 200 American citizens who want to leave Afghanistan and didn't make it out before the deadline. I've been told some U.S. citizens who showed up to the airport before the deadline were left standing outside the gates. They were unable to get in. How are you going to get those Americans out? And what was the reason that some citizens could not get in? Was it entirely because of terrorist threats to Hamid Karzai International Airport?
Well, Jake, I think it's really important to answer your question, to start with the fact that we gave 19 messages starting in March to Americans to leave the country. We offered them financial assistance to leave the country. And then for more than 2 weeks, we gave them specific instructions for how to come. 97% of the people we communicated with got to the airport and got out on planes. There's a variety of reasons for why those remaining folks didn't. Some changed their mind at the last minute. Some wanted to bring very large extended family who were not Americans, who couldn't get through checkpoints. Some may have shown up at the airport, although I have to tell you, I'm not familiar, and General McKenzie spoke yesterday and said he was not familiar with anyone being turned away at the gate at the last minute. So I had not heard that particular report. But the fact is that we went out of our way for 2 full weeks to create the circumstances for any American who wanted to get to the airport and get on a plane to do so. And the question the president ultimately faced was, how long do I keep U.S. Marines in harm's way with threats escalating hour by hour? How many more days do I do that? He ultimately decided it was right to end it and to shift to a diplomatic mission. And we have plenty of leverage with the Taliban to help effectuate the safe passage of any further Americans who want to leave Afghanistan.
Did release 5,000 prisoners last year, including some of the Taliban's top war commanders. So the president was walking into that circumstance. He wanted to leave Afghanistan. It's a war he has long felt we needed to depart from. He's felt that was long overdue. But that was the circumstance he walked into, and frankly, there's a little bit of selective memory loss from some of the people who served in the last administration about these circumstances.
But my question was actually, why hold on to the Afghan envoy, the U.S. envoy to Afghanistan, who served under President Trump? Why did President Biden hold on to him?
The president has made changes where he saw fit and has not made changes where he felt the person continued to be the right person for the job. That's not a political decision. Go ahead.
Thanks, Jen. So we heard from the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, this morning on Good Morning America. He's mentioned that 98% of those on the ground there in Afghanistan and a small number who remain, they have reached out. They got out, as many people as they could. Is the administration essentially placing blame on Americans who could not get to the airport in time?
I think what the president stated clearly, and I know that Jake Sullivan has stated clearly, and our Secretary of State has stated clearly, is that our commitment remains. There is not an end to our commitment to American citizens who are in Afghanistan who want to leave. That's the same for any country in the world, for American citizens who want to leave and want to come home to the United States. It's also important for people to note and understand what the process has been and what we've undergone over the past few months, and that's what the president laid out, and we think it's still important for the American people here in the United States to understand that.
One on al-Qaeda. So we heard from the president a few moments ago saying that one of the main reasons to go into this war was to get al-Qaeda. We have heard that Osama bin Laden's security chief has reportedly returned to Afghanistan and has been seen in public. Do you still believe, or does the administration believe, that al-Qaeda is no longer a threat to America? And given the ISIS attacks that we've seen in the last week, how confident is the administration that Afghanistan isn't already a safe haven for terrorists?
Well, I think first there is a very big difference between terrorists' ability to attack U.S. troops in Kabul and to attack the homeland. And we do not assess that any terrorist group on the ground has the ability to attack the homeland in the United States. It is incumbent upon the president, the national security team, to prevent that from ever being the case. But there is a very big difference between those two.
Go ahead.
I know that the military obviously recommended to the president, or at least you said they recommended to the president that it would be best to leave, keep that August 31st deadline. But the president himself, in his interview with ABC News, said that if there's American citizens left, quote, we're going to stay until we get them all out. I think the president's explained his rationale for leaving 100+ Americans behind. But can you talk about why he allowed his credibility on this issue to sort of go out the door on making a flat promise and then not keeping it?
Well, first I would say that the president remains committed to getting every American citizen who wants to get out. That's an enduring commitment, one that will not change, and one we're going to focus on every single day. I would also note that over the course of the last 2 weeks, we have seen a terrorist attack that took the lives of 13 of our service members. And there was and part of our assessment always is going to be the risks, a risk assessment. So I think the question was, do you leave 6,000 service members as there are heightening threats, heightening risks every single day? Or do you work through a diplomatic process and efforts to ensure that we will have the ability to get these American citizens out? That's the assessment we made.
I mean, after that terror attack, you and he made clear that you weren't going to let the terrorists sort of dictate the timeline. So
And we didn't, and we've evacuated tens of thousands of people since then.
I guess, was it a mistake for the president to have promised that we would remain until everybody left the country?
We are going to get every American citizen out. That has not changed.
One last one on, you mentioned the leverage that we might have and how access to the global marketplace was a big element of that. Can you kind of explain how the sanctions regime that's currently on the Taliban is going to apply to what is now the government of Afghanistan? Is there a chance for Afghanistan, the country, to access its reserves or sort of avoid those sanctions? Will the central bank be sanctioned? Are they going to have that ability as part of this sort of partnership that you've talked about?
Well, it's going to be based on what their behavior is. And I think the president clearly outlined that we're going to be watching, as the world will, what the Taliban does. That is certainly allowing American citizens to depart. It's certainly allowing Afghans and our partners to depart. It's also how they operate as it relates to treatment of women, to human rights. There's a range of factors at play here. So I don't have anything to predict for you. Obviously, there's a great deal of economic leverage. You referenced sanctions that are already in place that we have, that the global community has, and we'll have to assess how things happen over the course of the coming days, weeks, and months. Go ahead, Jackie.
Thanks, Jen. One question on the dignified transfer, and then I want to get to Afghanistan. Some of the Gold Star families have criticized the president's conduct at the dignified transfer. There was a father of one Marine who said that the president appeared to be checking his watch every time a flag-draped transfer case came out of the plane. And a sister of another Marine said that it felt like a fake and scripted apology. Was the president looking at his watch, and does he have a message to those people who felt that they were offended?
Well, I would say his message to all of the family members who were there, those who were not even in attendance, is that he is grateful to their sons and daughters, the sacrifice they made to the country, that he knows firsthand what it's like to lose a child, and the fact that no one can tell you anything or say anything, or there's no words that are going to fill that hole that is left by that. He's not going to speak to, and I'm not going to speak to, the private conversations. Of course, they have the right to convey whatever they would like. But I will tell you, from spending a lot of time with him over the past couple of days, that he was deeply impacted by these family members who he met just 2 days ago, that he talks about them frequently in meetings, and the incredible service and sacrifice of their sons and daughters. That is not going to change their suffering.
I want you to know tonight on CBS begins with 60 Minutes and unidentified aerial phenomena.